So, percent. Percent is one of those mathematical ideas that gets thrown around an awful lot. Right? So, one of the places that we might meet percent in the news, for example, is we might hear 47% of voters. We might hear 47% of voters favor candidate X. What does that mean? Okay, so how did we read this symbol? This symbol that we write with two little circles with a slash between them. Notice that these are circles, not dots. We read this as percent. Per cent. If you look at super old texts, they write this as two words. Per cent. What does that mean? Per means for every. And cent, that's like cents in a dollar. Cent means 100. So per cent literally means for every 100. What does that mean? If I say 47% of voters favor candidate X, that means for every 100 voters, 47 favor candidate X. So a percent describes a part of a group. Or it might describe something else that we'll talk about in a moment. The whole group, we call that the base. And then the part that has the property we describe, we call the part. In our candidate X example, the base is all the voters, and the part is those that favor candidate X. Now, what does this mean in terms of exactly how many voters favor candidate X? We'll think about that later. For now, this describes the fact that if I took 100 typical voters and put them together in a room, I expect that 47 of them are going to be in favor of candidate X. Right, now there's another way that we use percent. Sometimes we use a percent to describe a rate. So an amount of one quantity as related to the amount of another quantity. So we might say, for example, this payday lender's effective annual interest rate is 273%. This is a big number. This is not saying out of every 100, there are 273 of something. What does this mean? This means for every $100 borrowed, you pay an extra $273 in interest every year. So in this case, the base is the amount we borrow. And part is a strange word to use in this case, but it's a comfortable word to use. So we'll continue to call this the part, even though that's a little bit misleading. So the part, in quotes, is the amount of interest that you pay. So we're going to see more of this use later on, but to begin with, we're going to focus just on this use, where we're talking about a part of a group, because these are kind of the simpler sorts of problems to think about involving percents. The rate type problems we'll talk about later. So I'm going to give you a story like this and ask you to describe just what is the base in words and what is the part, again, in words. So suppose you saw an ad that said, 83% of dentists surveyed recommend Crestor brand toothpaste. In this story, what is the base and what is the part? Pause the video and see if you can work this out now. All right, so 83% of dentists surveyed recommend Crestor. So it sounds like this is describing A big group of dentists, and part of that group recommend Crestor. So the base is the dentists surveyed, and the part is those who recommend Crestor. Now, there's a specific way that we use words around percent. If we're going to say what the base is explicitly, we will always say percent of. So always the preposition is of. We don't use any other word to introduce the base. That's just a thing about English grammar and how English grammar functions around percents. When in doubt, look for this percent of to help you find the base. But if you look at the big picture of the problem, it's often easier to figure out what the base ought to be just from the overall context.